The man with the most celebrated voice in gospel music spent years telling people his voice was never the point. Sit with that for a moment, because it changes everything that follows. David Phelps, the lyric tenor whose upper register has stopped audiences cold in arenas across America, whose voice has been replayed at hospital bedsides and funeral services and quiet moments of personal crisis for 3 decades, said plainly, and more than once, that the voice itself was always the least important thing about his ministry. Most people heard that and filed it under humility, the kind of gracious deflection that artists in the gospel world learn to offer when the praise gets heavier than they know what to do with. What those people missed was something closer to a warning, and nobody in the Gaither Vocal Band community fully understood that until recently, when David confirmed what his closest friends had already suspected, and when his wife Shae finally spoke about what the family had been quietly carrying for longer than most fans realized. By the end of this video, you will understand why David said that, why the voice was never the point, and why what has been unfolding in this family over the last several years reads not as a story of loss, even though it will feel that way at first, but as something older and harder to categorize than that. Stay with us, because what surfaces around the 10-minute mark is the piece of this story that reframes every recording David Phelps has ever made. For anyone coming to this story without years spent inside the Gaither homecoming world, here is what matters about David Phelps. By any serious measure, he ranks among the 2 or 3 most gifted lyric tenors ever to perform in the American gospel tradition. And that is not a casual claim. His range sits well outside what formal training alone can produce. His technical control represents the kind that classical coaches spend entire careers attempting to develop in students, and his ability to carry genuine emotional weight inside a lyric, not just beauty but actual meaning, cannot be taught and cannot be rehearsed into existence. Joining the Gaither Vocal Band in 1997, David stepped into a group that already carried enormous expectation from a devoted Christian music audience. And within the first few months, it became clear to everyone paying attention. The role wasn't being filled, it was being redefined. For millions of people who discovered the Gaither homecoming videos through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, David Phelps represented something specific, a moment in the room when everything else went quiet. People who have followed his career through the Homecoming concert series, through the Gaither Music Company recordings, and through his solo catalog, can tell you exactly where they were the first time they heard him close. Because a voice carrying that degree of precision and that degree of soul simultaneously does not just reach the ears. For millions of fans who grew up watching those homecoming videos and listening to those gospel recordings, David wasn't simply a singer. He was woven into the soundtrack of their faith. Before any of what this video covers entered the picture, his life carried the look of a calling fully realized, a marriage to Shae built on shared faith and honest partnership, 4 children, a solo career running alongside his work with the Gaither Vocal Band, and a reputation in the gospel music community built entirely on authenticity. People trusted David Phelps, not just his talent, but his character, his testimony, and his consistency between the person on stage and the person off it. That trust is exactly why what he has had to acknowledge recently landed the way it did. Understanding what has been happening requires going back not to a single dramatic event, but to a pattern, a series of quiet signals that devoted fans of David Phelps, the kind who have listened for 20 and 25 years, began catching and carrying privately, unsure what to do with the worry forming beneath their affection. Vocal health had always occupied serious attention in David's world, and that makes complete sense at his level of performance. The instrument demands the same discipline any world-class instrument demands: rest, careful management of a touring schedule, and vigilance about the kind of cumulative strain that can quietly erode even the most resilient voice if the early signs go unaddressed. But somewhere in the years following his most recent chapter with the Gaither Vocal Band, fans started noticing things in his concert appearances that didn't line up with what they remembered. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would make headlines, but subtle adjustments that the casual listener would walk right past while a devoted fan felt immediately. A passage taken a half-step lower than the recording. A moment of hesitation before a run that once arrived without effort. The kinds of changes that long-term fans of gospel music, the ones who have lived with these recordings through illness and grief and spiritual dry seasons, recognized before they could name what they were recognizing. Comments started surfacing slowly. In the YouTube threads beneath homecoming videos. In the Facebook groups populated by the same audience that had made these recordings part of the furniture of their faith lives. Nobody wanted to be the one to say it directly, because the people asking carry real affection for David Phelps, but the question kept forming anyway. Something feels different. And then quieter still, what does that mean for what comes next? David didn't address it publicly in those early months, which was almost certainly medically prudent, genuinely personal, and completely understandable. But here's the thing about silence when a devoted fan base is already worried. It doesn't hold the space open, it fills it, and worry tends to expand to fill every inch available. That's when Shae began giving fuller answers in the moments when fans asked directly, not formal statements, not carefully managed press responses, but the kind of plain, honest replies that come from a woman who has watched people misread the situation long enough that the truth, offered carefully, started to feel more merciful than anything the rumor would eventually become. Stay with us, because what David said in his own words, and what Shae confirmed separately, in a setting considerably more candid than any formal interview, is the part of this story that the gospel music press has almost completely passed over, and it's the part that gives everything else its proper shape. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle anticipated. David Phelps, across conversations shared publicly through interviews and direct fan interactions over the last several years, began acknowledging something that artists at his level rarely give voice to with this degree of plainness. The voice, that singular instrument that built his entire public identity, has required him to make real choices, the kind that carry genuine grief alongside them. What he said openly was that the upper register defining his most celebrated performances, and that the biology of the voice changes in ways that no amount of discipline can fully override. The high C that arrived like breathing at 35 presents a different negotiation at 55, and that is true of every serious tenor who has ever performed at this level. Most artists navigate that reckoning quietly, adjusting their repertoire, lowering keys, letting the arrangement carry what the voice once carried alone, and hoping nobody notices until the gap closes naturally. What David chose instead was harder and considerably rarer. He chose to say it plainly. In a moment that longtime fans of the Gaither Homecoming series found both difficult and deeply moving, David acknowledged that passages he once performed a certain way no longer get performed that way, not because the artistry has thinned, because anyone who has heard him in recent years will confirm that his phrasing and his interpretive instincts run richer and more considered than they ever did at peak technical capacity, but because wisdom in his own framing means knowing what your instrument can give today and refusing to ask it for what it no longer has. For the people who turned to his gospel recordings during the hardest years of their lives, hearing David Phelps say plainly that even he has to reckon with limitation landed somewhere deep and stayed there. Shae's response to that season confirmed what those following the family closely had begun to sense, and she didn't frame it as complaint or as lament. Her words carried the texture of testimony, the kind that only comes from someone who has already moved through the worst of it and arrived somewhere on the other side with their faith, not just intact but larger somehow. What she described were nights when David wrestled with what this transition meant for who he was, because for an artist whose gift is as singular as his, the voice isn't a career tool. It's a calling, the primary language of his relationship with God and with the people he serves through music. And when that instrument requires renegotiation, the question that surfaces isn't professional, it's existential. The question of who you are in ministry when the specific thing you were made to do starts asking different things of you. Shae described a process requiring time, prayer, and the kind of honest conversation that most marriages avoid because the stakes feel too high to examine directly. The faith she described doesn't look like certainty. It looks like continuing to show up when the answers haven't arrived yet, and her words on that point have stayed with the people who heard them. What she told the people listening was that watching David walk through this season taught her more about the nature of calling than any sermon she had ever sat under. that a calling doesn't conclude when the vessel changes, and that what God places in a person runs deeper than what that person can produce on any given night, on any given stage. For the gospel community, that statement functioned as both a comfort and a revelation, because the fear fans had been carrying quietly. The deeper fear beneath the surface question about his voice wasn't simply that the instrument was changing. The deeper fear was that he might step away entirely, that the concerts would stop, and the recordings would stop, and the presence that had meant so much to so many people would quietly leave the picture. On that fear, David has been direct. He isn't going anywhere. What he's doing instead is something more considered, learning in his own words to trust the ministry more than the mechanism, to bring what he has on a given night with full commitment and full gratitude, and leave the outcome where it belongs. That is the lesson every believer eventually gets asked to learn. And for David Phelps, it arrived at the intersection of his greatest gift and his most visible limitation, in full view of the community that loves him most. For those of us who have followed David's journey across the years, through the Gaither Vocal Band recordings and the solo albums and the homecoming stages and the Christmas specials and all the private moments when his voice reached us in ways we didn't always have language for, this chapter reads not as a diminishment, but as a deepening. Watching an artist of David's standing choose honesty over illusion carries a quiet weight that is worth naming directly. The transition could have been managed invisibly, as plenty of artists manage it, and the casual listener would never have known the difference. David chose otherwise, choosing to let people in the way he has given the gospel community something more durable than another flawless performance. What it gave them was a witness. What does that witness tell us about faith? It tells us that the most authentic faith isn't the kind that never finds a wall. It's the kind that finds the wall, registers what it costs to keep going, and moves forward anyway. It tells us that ministry doesn't hold its value only at full capacity, that bringing what you have today with full honesty and full commitment still reaches the people who need to be reached, that the offering isn't diminished by what you cannot give when everything you can give accompanies it. There are people watching this right now who aren't thinking about David Phelps's voice at all. They are thinking about their own version of this question, a career that changed without asking permission, a health situation that reordered the possible, a gift or capacity that the years have quietly revised in ways they didn't choose and couldn't prevent. What Shae's words do, in the way that lived testimony does what no prepared speech can do, is tell those people that this is survivable, that the calling out lasts the crisis, and that the person God made you to be doesn't retire when your circumstances change shape. Something else deserves to be named here. The gospel music community has not always made it easy for its artists to be fully human in public. The expectation, rarely spoken but unmistakably present across generations of Christian music, has often been that gospel artists represent something beyond ordinary human fragility, that they carry a standard of testimony leaving little room for the kind of plain reckoning David and Shae have modeled. Choosing transparency anyway, in that climate represents a form of courage, not the loud kind that gets recognized immediately, but the quiet, daily kind that costs more over time than any single performance ever did. For anyone who has been a fan of David Phelps since the early homecoming days, you know exactly what is meant when we say his voice was never just entertainment. It was invitation. It was evidence that something holy was available, that beauty of that particular order pointed somewhere real. And that hasn't changed. It has simply taken a form asking more of us as listeners and giving us more in return. One more part of this story hasn't been widely connected yet, and it matters. David's journey isn't unfolding in a vacuum. Among the extended circle of artists who built the Gaither homecoming phenomenon across 30 years, a quiet, ongoing conversation has been taking shape about what it means to continue in gospel music at the season of life, where many of them now find themselves. Bill Gaither himself has spoken with characteristic directness about aging in ministry, about the difference between what you built and what you leave behind, and about the moment when the work shifts from performing to passing things forward. Guy Penrod, who stepped away from the Gaither Vocal Band in 2009 to raise his 8 children and build a solo ministry on his own terms, has returned to the question of calling versus capacity repeatedly in his public conversations since then. Mark Lowry, whose humor has always functioned as a vehicle for genuine theological honesty, brings up mortality and legacy with increasing frequency and increasing candor in his interviews. None of these are morbid conversations. They are mature ones. The conversations of people who spent their professional lives pointing audiences towards something eternal, and are now reckoning personally with what that means from the inside. What David is doing, what he and Shae have chosen to model for the people watching, fits into that larger picture. A generation of gospel artists, who gave the Homecoming concert series and the Gaither Music Company recordings their emotional center, are now in the chapter where the most important testimony isn't what they accomplish, but how they finish. Not the performance at the peak, but the faithfulness through the valley. Bill Gaither has said across many settings over many years that the songs matter more than the singers, that the point was never the individual voices but the message those voices carried. David Phelps, in the way he has navigated this particular season, appears to have received that wisdom completely, and the gospel community is getting the gift of watching it lived out in real time. What comes next for David Phelps and his family is something the people who love his work will be watching, not with dread, but with a particular tenderness reserved for someone whose life has meant something real to you. The concerts continue. The voice continues, not unchanged but present. Not exactly as it was, but honest about what it is. And that honesty, as Shae has made plain, isn't a concession to what couldn't be helped. It's a choice, made deliberately, in full view of an audience that deserved the truth. What remains less certain, and what sits at the open center of this story, is how David himself understands the shape of what comes next. Artists who survive this kind of transition rarely become less than they were. More often they become something different, something harder to categorize, and sometimes something more honest than anything they produced when everything came easily. The recordings David Phelps makes in this chapter of his life won't sound like end of the beginning, and no one who loves that performance should expect them to. But they will carry something that the recordings of a younger man, however brilliant, could not carry. The weight of a person who looked directly at limitation and chose, again and again, to keep showing up. None of that is a lesser thing. If anything, it's the rarer one. The question Shae's words leave deliberately open, and it is worth sitting with before moving on to anything else today, is what faithfulness looks like when the terms change without your consent, when the gift you built your life around asks to be held differently, when the calling remains but the form of it requires trusting what you cannot yet see from where you are standing. David doesn't have a final answer to that question yet, and neither does Shae, and that perhaps is exactly the point. Faith arriving with all its answers already in order isn't really faith. What this family is showing is something older and harder and more honest than any plan. It's the daily, ordinary, costly decision to keep going, to keep singing, to keep trusting that what was given, in whatever form it takes today, remains enough for the work it was always meant to do. Fans who have followed this ministry for decades carry one certainty with them, and it holds: David Phelps's story isn't finished. Not by a long measure. If this story reached you today, the next video we have prepared will as well. We've been covering what has been quietly unfolding in the lives of several Gaither Vocal Band alumni, and what came out of those conversations is every bit as unexpected and as honest as what you heard here.